Hello class, and welcome to our first lecture of the semester in research methods in psychology. This first talk that we're going to give is a little bit of an anomaly, and I want to provide some context before we get started. First of all, this is going to be broken down into 3 parts so that these are digestible sizes that can be uploaded to YouTube and then can be viewed at your convenience, but I obviously do recommend that you watch them in order. So this is part 1 of 3. And this is a standalone lecture that does not relate directly to a chapter in the textbook, but I feel it's a good idea to include whenever you're teaching someone an introduction to research methods. So this is a lecture that's really going to focus on the history and the philosophy and the origins of science as a whole. I believe that philosophy and psychology go hand in various ways and that they are clearly tied to one another. And in fact, we can really look at all science as beginning with philosophy. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the philosophical origins of science, but I want to explain why that's important and why I think that's a relevant topic for us to include in this class. Essentially, it provides some context. It provides some bedrock for us to begin our conversation about how we practice science. You might say that, before you can learn a language, you have to learn its alphabet. You have to learn its grammatical structures before you start building up vocabulary. Well, this is the underlying alphabet of science, so to speak. This is the bedrock that it rests upon. So if we don't understand empiricism as an approach to the world, and I'll define and explain what I mean by empiricism a little down the road, if we don't understand empiricism as an approach to understanding the world, then we don't fundamentally understand science as a whole. So that's where we're going to start today, and I know it's a bit of a departure. I'm going to talk about this during the live Zoom meeting as well. If this information seems out of left field or overwhelming for this first lecture, please relax. This is simply something that I think is a good precursor to diving into the textbook and getting more specific. But I recognize that it might not be exactly what you expected or signed up for right out of the gate, so please don't be worried about the entire class really having the same tone as this first lecture. As I mentioned in our initial Zoom meeting, I like to play music, and a lot of my career in playing music has been, playing restaurants and bars and things like that, where your job is to provide entertainment. And so, you play some original songs, but you often play a lot of covers. And some covers you choose because you know people will like them, right? They're more inclined to tip, they're going to enjoy themselves, whatever it is, whatever your motivation is. And some songs you play because you enjoy playing them. And sometimes those are not the songs that are going to, get everyone in the room tapping their feet and paying attention to what it is you're doing, but you play them because you enjoy creating or covering that particular song. And so I sometimes joke that, this lecture is kind of one for me. This one's not for the crowd, but really it's for me to get to indulge a side of science that I think is very important and is fundamental, but it's also something that I had a great passion for, have a great passion for based upon my studies in the past. So let's dive right in, and as I said, kind of, just take things as they come, and you will hopefully soon see the relevance as this relates to our practice of engaging in psychological research. Okay. I want to start off with a couple of important quotes here from two giants in the world of science and philosophy, respectively, or vice versa. First of all, with a quote from Aristotle. And of course, you can put aside for a moment the phrasing of this, which is steeped in an ancient tradition of sort of misogynistic statements about humanity as a whole by using the term men. But Aristotle is quoted as saying, "All men by nature desire to know." Basically saying that as human beings, we have an inherent interest in trying to understand things. And I think that really is at the root of science. We are attempting to make sense of the world around us. And Einstein, while he did acknowledge there were certain aspects of physics that were somewhat disturbing to him, that the idea of understanding things in that way was somewhat off-putting, he fundamentally believed that the world was understandable. And so this quote is, "The eternal mystery of the universe is its comprehensibility." It was striking to Einstein that through the exercise of our minds, through utilizing reason and physics and mathematics, we were able to understand some really incredible fundamental things about the universe. And so I think this is an important thing to have in mind as we talk about science and what its purpose is and what it means to us. So, as I mentioned, this lecture is going to touch on the philosophical origins of science. Where does science come from? And I would argue that it does grow from our earliest traditions, especially in the West, of philosophy. Might be a good moment to stop for a second and talk about this. I tried to make this lecture as general and as inclusive as possible, but I certainly understand that my education and my particular culture that I bring to the table is very Western in its approach, and so I certainly think that we can look to other parts of the world for their own origins of philosophy and science as a whole, but I am focusing on sort of the more traditional Western definition of science, and so therefore the philosophical underpinnings come from those same traditions. And of course, as all Western philosophical traditions, it starts with the Greeks primarily. Um, but so even the word itself, philosophy, has Greek origins: philia, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So the love of wisdom, the love of knowledge. Um, and it really focuses on understanding fundamental concepts. And I have the word fundamental in italics for a reason. The thing that underpins what we do, understanding things at their most basic level, trying to break them down to their core concepts as best we can. So in that sense, philosophy seeks to get to the bottom of things. We have this phrase, right? The bottom of things. We are seeking to get to a level of understanding that is very fundamental and crucial, and allows us to understand where these things come from. So many of the earliest famous philosophers were also philosophers of science. They did focus on all aspects of science in their work. Aristotle, Descartes, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Stuart Mill, Bertrand Russell, Isaac Newton. These are all philosophers in the Western tradition who had great contributions to make, not only to philosophy but to science, and some of them key contributors, especially Isaac Newton and Aristotle and Descartes. So there are many great scientists who were philosophically oriented. On the flip side of that, right, there were many people that we think of more exclusively as scientists, but who themselves were extremely interested in philosophy. That includes Galileo, Darwin, Niels Bohr, who's the father of the atomic model, Richard Dawkins, who's a modern example, the author of The Selfish Gene, of course known for some of his controversial views regarding atheism and Islam, but ultimately Dawkins is a core researcher in the field of genetics and the understanding of how genes interact in their environment. And so he, of course, touches on a lot of things in his personal career that involve philosophy as well. So this street goes both ways, and that's very common, especially in the earlier days of science. There was much less of a divide seen between science and philosophy. They were considered one and the same. So Aristotle speculated in particular that nature, and by nature he means the world around us, right, the world that we experience. Aristotle speculated that there was an inherent language, which he called logos in the Greek, that somehow suits it for human comprehension. What he was essentially saying was that nature itself has something inherent to it that allows us to understand it. In a way, nature is speaking to us, right? It is very well suited for us to apply our reason, to apply our minds to it, and therefore understand it. But there's an opposing view, of course, that many people since Aristotle have held, which is more of a postmodern or an approach that's more subjective, that says that we can't really understand the world. We can't truly understand the universe, that the universe is inscrutable, so to speak, and that it's otherwise indifferent to our attempts to understand it, but that what we're doing through science and through philosophy is we're projecting human categories, human templates, human ways of thinking onto the world. So we're translating something that it can't truly be understood into a form that makes sense to us. So we're projecting our worldview based upon our senses and our reason onto a universe to try and make sense of it, but we're not understanding it on an objective level truly. And so those are the disputes you often see in science about what it's trying to do. Some people think that science will help us to truly understand the universe, whereas other people see it as a tool that helps us to make sense of it while not necessarily revealing, these fundamental objective mysteries about it. So it kind of leads to this basic question: is the world discovered or constructed by science? Okay, are we genuinely uncovering something fundamental about the universe, or are we simply constructing a view of the world through scientific endeavor and through philosophical endeavor as well? But ultimately, I just want to focus on the idea that philosophy concerns itself with fundamental problems and concepts at the core of all human activity. Things like the nature of knowledge, what is knowledge itself, the structure of reality, the meaning and value of life, etc. All of these big questions begin with philosophy. But science as a child of philosophy, also tries to make sense of this. Now, we might be focusing on something very discrete and very specific, like the nature of the gene within a certain DNA strand, or we may be focusing on the way that two chemicals interact in a chemistry setting. But ultimately, we're trying to discern meaning about the universe, so there is that larger umbrella concept behind it all. So let's try to understand a little bit about philosophy itself. Let's break down philosophy a little bit and understand where it's coming from, so therefore we're able to understand how it relates to science. So there are some core fields in philosophy that I want to talk about. When I was originally trained as a philosophy student, I was studying psychology and philosophy sort of at a parallel time when I was an undergrad, and I had some really great fundamental core classes in philosophy. And I remember someone kind of drawing a diagram on the board one day of a triangle and essentially calling it sort of this is the tripod of philosophy, so to speak. And that was epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. The idea that this is the three ways in which we look at the world, the three subfields of philosophy. And so those are included in this list of 5 here. But I want to really start by talking about that tripod, right? And I think metaphysics, albeit at the end of this list, is a good place to start. Metaphysics essentially asks, what is the nature of reality? Right? What is the state and what is the being and the nature of reality? What are things? Okay, so we might think of metaphysics as attempting to define things around us, define the world, define the universe, that sort of thing. That begs a certain question, which is hopefully answered by the concept of epistemology. Epistemology is the study of the nature and scope of knowledge and belief. So you might say that epistemology is how do we know things? How do we come to understand the world? So if we have a metaphysics that said the world is this, the world is X, epistemology asks the question, well, how do you know that? How did you arrive at that understanding of X? So metaphysics, epistemology, and then finally ethics can be thought of as how do we apply this to the world? So I'm making propositions about what the world is and how I came to arrive at that knowledge. What do I do with this information? What's a good way for me to behave in line with that understanding of the universe? So ethics studies things like what is the right, what is the good, what is the value. And of course it includes not just abstract ethics, but applied ethics. How do we behave in specific situations and specific real world things that we find ourselves engaging with? So you've got that sort of triad of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. We can also talk within philosophy about aesthetics, which is sort of the study of the nature of beauty and art and taste and subjectivity. It talks about personal kinds of truth and how we create them. And then logic is an offshoot of philosophy, but this is a study of how we reason. And logic is crucial and important in understanding empiricism, the process of science we're going to talk about throughout this course. Because logic looks at how we go from point A to point B, right? The nature of our reasoning and how valid are those arguments. A huge part of logic is to say, if then, if A, then B, well, okay, we need to evaluate and see if this makes sense. If we can break down all of those pieces, if we can define A and we can define B and we can look at how they're related to one another, is that actually a statement that has value? Is that a statement that makes sense through our reasoning process? So we're trying to document not only is this a good argument, but in many cases in logic what we're doing is we're looking for fallacies, mistakes within that way of thinking. And there are plenty of examples we can talk about of what they call logical fallacies, right? Ad hominem attacks and false equivalencies and sort of those sorts of things. But I don't want to get into too much detail. This is not a philosophy class, but I would like to move on in the next slide and talk a little bit more about metaphysics and a little bit of aspects of metaphysics as they apply to science. So these are sort of subtypes of metaphysics. And remember, metaphysics is the way in which we define the world. What is the world? How do we, what do we understand the world to be? The first is a concept called ontology. And this is the philosophical study of the nature of being, becoming, existence, or reality, as well as what are the basic categories of reality and their relationships to one another, their being. So ontology really talks about the origins of things, not only what is the world, but how did it arrive, how did it come to be, is where ontology really weighs in. A concept which is very relevant to psychology in particular and science as a whole is called the philosophy of the mind, which is where we really study the nature of the mind itself, mental events and functions, properties, consciousness, and how this relates to the physical body, including the brain, right? So how do we go from this piece of soft tissue contained within our skull to subjectivity, to consciousness, to awareness of ourselves, right? There's a distinction being made between the brain and the mind. The mind is an abstract concept. The brain is a real physiological organ in our heads. So this is an important branch of metaphysics that definitely has applications for psychology. Also, one aspect of metaphysics, which often is involved in applied physics, is philosophy of space and time. So the character of space and time, and how do we understand them? Are they subjectively created by virtue of the senses that we have, or is there something fundamentally that can be understood about the universe by looking at space and time? And of course, you've all heard of people like Einstein and Stephen Hawking who apply their thinking to this area. And then finally, a lot of early physics really talked about the philosophy of action. If you think about Isaac Newton, he's a good example of how do we, through human bodily movements, through exerting force on the world, how does that engage with the universe, right? If we exert force on an object, how does that happen? How do we apply force to an object, and then what happens to that object? And of course, you're all familiar with Newtonian laws of physics. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. An object of rest tends to stay at rest. Things such as this. We're going to talk a little bit about Isaac Newton in greater detail in this lecture later on. But these are subtypes, sub-aspects of metaphysics that I want you to be familiar with, and you're going to see how they relate to science as a whole. Okay, so let's begin at the beginning, right? Where does science come from? What is the origin of science? And we might say, well, first and foremost, it has ancient sources, right? As long as human beings have had consciousness, as long as we've been conscious, we've essentially been engaging in something that resembles science, right? We've been at least taking the first steps along the road towards something that is akin to science. So science has ancient beginnings in humanity. Cosmology might be thought of as the oldest of the sciences. Cosmology is essentially creation myths. Where does the world come from? And every culture of humanity has creation myths. They have ideas about where the world comes from. So, for example, the Babylonians in the early Western civilizations, they thought that, the supreme god Marduk made the earth and sky by splitting his rival Tiamat into two, that created the earth and the sky through this great battle, and that was how the earth was created. The Sumerians have a concept called the Eridu-Genesis that comes from a tablet about 1600 BCE. The Egyptians have a theory that the god Nun produced the world out of limitless ocean while delegating lesser tasks to his subordinates, the other gods of the Egyptian pantheon. Of course, we have the Judeo-Christian concept of Genesis, and the idea that God created the earth, conveyed kingship of the earth to man. Lots of cultures have theories of the Great Flood or La Deluge. So that we find this in the myth in the Bible in terms of Noah and the Great Flood myth. But of course, lots of cultures, especially those that were close to large bodies of water and rivers that tended to flood, have creation myths that involve a flood of one form or another. There's Native American and Yoruba beliefs of creations of the world from clay, from a ball of clay, and humans being made from that. So these are all just examples of early cosmologies, early ideas about where the world comes from. But essentially what cosmology says is, how did our world come to be, and why does it have the structure that it has? Okay, why is the world as it is? And the earliest cosmologies that we have access to, they basically assume that there's design and there's effort by intelligent beings. Most creation myths are not just that the world is created at random. Now, you might look at modern science and modern physics and discussion about the Big Bang Theory and things like that, which may argue just out of pure physical properties the universe is created. But most early creation myths have a prime mover, a person or a thing or an intelligence who is acting upon the universe to create the world. And you can imagine that this makes perfect sense if you are an early culture of humanity and you're recognizing that, hey, we're able to influence the world in certain ways. We can build a dam and turn this stream into a reservoir. We can plant things in the earth and see them become food that we can then eat to subsist. We are seeing ourselves manipulating the world in various ways. And we're seeing that our human effort produces products. And so therefore it makes sense that our creation myths would also involve some actor or some person engaging with the universe and doing something to create them. So even nomadic hunter-gatherers, early human cultures, are making things, even if we're not talking about, established civilizations. But as civilization is established, you see even more of this, even greater manipulation of the physical environment, and even more ability to have cultures grow and live in larger numbers and have greater comforts. And therefore, it makes sense that as those cultures develop and they develop their own cosmologies, they involve a sense of someone acting on the world. But as a scientific question, it's basically asking, what is it? This thing that I perceive, what is it? Right? That is the crux of early cosmology. And a lot of this also involved early astronomy. The stars were something that were so prominent in a world that doesn't have the light pollution we have in our world today. In cultures where when the sun went down, things got pretty dark. Outside of your attempts, but prior to electric lighting, you could use fires and torches, obviously, and candles. But ultimately, it was a world that interacted a lot more with darkness and therefore with the stars in the sky and the heavenly bodies. And so you have a severe interest amongst human cultures to understand what are these things that we perceive that we never really interact with. Immediately human culture began to notice the motions of the heavenly bodies and that they were not fixed in the sky. Obviously with a better perspective and less light pollution, as I mentioned, you were much more able to see some of these things like the course of comets across the sky at certain times during the year, or how certain obvious and distinct stars would move throughout the sky. There was always a sense of motion for most cosmologies, and therefore there was a need to track and plot and understand the relationships between these bodies and how they related to the Earth that we were on. Even if you didn't understand that was the case at the time, even if your model of the universe didn't understand that, you still saw the motion and had to make sense of it. And therefore we started to see mathematics, even if it was as simple as just tracking the days of the year to understand the seasons, because that had real world implications into things like preparing and planting and harvesting, getting ready for the winter, right? So science is starting to work its way into our understanding of the world just for pragmatic reasons. But something like science as we think of it today, okay, so something as a scientific endeavor that we would recognize as modern human beings, really begins to emerge, at least in the West, amongst the ancient Greeks on the island of Miletus around 650 BCE. And there was a very famous group of early scientists, early philosophers, Greek philosophers, who lived there and engaged in scientific debate and discussion, sort of established some of the very first schools of Western thought. And what they were really asking each other and what they were debating about was, what is everything made of? So this group, these early scientists, these early philosophers, were really trying to understand the substance of the world around them. And they're sometimes referred to as the one and many, meaning that they tend to account for the world in a singular or a very few pure natural principles, but of course they all had different ideas, therefore the one and the many, right? They tended to be very monolithic in their thinking, very focused on one or a very few small triumvirate of things that the world was made up of. And so some of these Greek names have been passed down to us through their writings, and some of them are more famous than others, but we have people like Thales, who believed that essentially everything is made of water. Now, when we now understand that 70% of our human bodies is essentially made of water, 70% of the earth is covered with it, that water is essential to life. So he's not too far off in many ways from focusing on water as the core principle of the universe. One of his peers, Anaxagoras, basically said everything is made up of the four elements. I'm sure you've heard of the four elements before. He defined the four elements as earth, air, fire, and water. So he saw those as four core fundamental ways of understanding the universe, and all of his scientific theories then stemmed from an understanding of the world, a cosmology, if you will, that involved those four elements. Anaximander was one who talked about everything being made up of the boundless, right? This idea of infinity working its way into our thinking already, which of course becomes important later in more abstract mathematics. Anaximenes, got away from the four elements and basically focused entirely on air. This idea that air was the fundamental core. Democritus, for which we get the name democracy from some of his other writings, He was one who said that everything is made up of atoms. In Greek it was atoms, more of a hyphenate in the pronunciation, but of course we now recognize this as atoms. And Democritus, far before we had any physical evidence of the atomic model or atomic theory, said that you can cut things, you can divide them, you can break them down, but eventually you reach a fundamental core structure that is uncuttable stuff, which is what atoms kind of is derived from in the Greek. So he said that essentially the universe, as you break it down, reaches a point where it can no longer be divided, and where you've reached something core and fundamental, and he called those atoms. And then probably the most famous of this school of thought at Miletus was Pythagoras, which of course we've named his name. The Pythagorean theorem is named after Pythagoras, but Pythagoras is so much more than just his theorem. He was one of the greatest thinkers of mathematics, especially of the ancient world. And Pythagoras took a very straightforward and controversial view that everything is made of numbers. He saw mathematics as the language of the world, a way of understanding it. Pythagoras was an interesting character. Pythagoras had essentially a cult of followers who were very vehemently committed to him and believed that he understood something very fundamental about the universe, and that was that we could understand it through understanding mathematics, and that was the way to go about it. So a little later in these early days of science, we start to see the emergence of formal mathematics, and specifically geometry as a major leap forward in humans' understanding of the universe around them and getting us closer from philosophy into science. So I'm sure that many of you have heard of Euclid. He was a Greek mathematician who was active in Alexandria and lived in the 3rd or 4th centuries BCE. He wrote a textbook which is arguably the most influential text in the history of mathematics. This book was, of course, written, 3 to 4 centuries before the modern era, but it remained the primary main textbook for teaching mathematics until the late 19th and even the early 20th century some places. I mean, I think very few people can have that claim to fame, that their sort of treatise on a field remained effectively the go-to textbook for, essentially 23 centuries or so. But Euclid provided a model not just of geometry, but of deductive reasoning. And so he went from the math to the logic. And he basically said that we reason through self-evident axioms or postulates. And he essentially gave us a model for deductive reasoning that applies very naturally to the way we do science today. His discoveries were thought to capture the only possible consistent geometry for 2,000 years. So essentially, Euclid presented his geometry, and that was the only version of geometry until essentially the modern era. And we since discovered what are now called non-Euclidean geometries. But he had the monopoly on geometry for 2,000 years. There are some other examples from this era that I'd like to talk about. Eudoxus and Ptolemy. These were early scientists and philosophers who were able to apply Euclid's principles with immense precision. They found that his propositions, his theories related to geometry, they worked. That once you had accurate measurement, you could prove them to be workable, that they applied very well to the universe around us and to observe things. So this set the stage for Galileo and Newton, essentially. This idea that the more precise your measurements, if you utilize Euclidean geometry, you can make really accurate estimates about what's going to happen next and how the things are going to move, how they're going to interact. And this also later helped to support this geocentric planetary system, the idea that that we lived on a planet which was involved in a system of other heavenly bodies, and that the sun was itself also a large heavenly body. Much of this was unknown until we were able to utilize geometry to make a strong argument that held up under scrutiny. As I said, followers of Pythagoras really pursued math with religious zeal as well. They held math up to such a high standard that it was the way we would understand the universe, that this really set the stage for people like Galileo and Newton down the road.